slaves, and indentured servants represent distinct categories of unfree labor and social structures, each with unique legal statuses and societal roles. Serfs were tied to the land they worked and owed labor or dues to feudal lords in exchange for protection, but were not considered property themselves. In contrast, slaves were treated as property, devoid of legal rights and subjected to forced labor and exploitation. Indentured servants, although bound by contracts for a specified period, retained some legal protections and the possibility of freedom after fulfilling their terms. A tenant farmer was bound to a hereditary plot of land and to the will of his landlord. From as early as the 2nd century AD, many of the large, privately held estates in the Roman Empire that had been worked by gangs of slaves were gradually broken up into peasant holdings. These peasants of the late Roman Empire, many of whom were descendants of slaves, came to depend on larger landowners and other important persons for protection from state tax collectors and, later, from barbarian invaders and oppressive neighbors. This practice, known as serfdom, continued into medieval Europe, where the majority of serfs obtained their subsistence by cultivating a hereditary plot of land that was owned by a lord in the feudal societies of Europe. This was the essential feature differentiating serfs from slaves, who were bought and sold without reference to a plot of land. The serf provided his own food and clothing from his own productive efforts. A substantial proportion of the grain the serf grew on his holding had to be given to his lord. The lord could also compel the serf to cultivate that portion of the lord's land that was not held by other tenants, called demesne land. The serf also had to use his lord's grain mills and no others. The essential additional mark of serfdom was the lack of many of the personal liberties that were held by freedmen. Chief among these was the serf's lack of freedom of movement. He could not permanently leave his holding or his village without his lord's permission. Neither could the serf marry, change his occupation, or dispose of his property without his lord's permission. He was bound to his designated plot of land and could be transferred along with that land to a new lord. Serfs were often harshly treated and had little legal redress against the actions of their lords. A serf could become a freedman only through manumission, that is, release from slavery, enfranchisement, the right to vote or full privileges of citizenship, or escape. The system limited their mobility and rights but did not equate them with chattel slavery. Slavery dates back to antiquity and spans many cultures, nationalities, and religions. Slavery is the ownership of a person as property, especially in regards to their labor. Slavery typically involves compulsory work, with the slave's location of work and residence dictated by the party that holds them in bondage. Enslavement is the placement of a person into slavery, and the person is called a slave or an enslaved person. Cases of enslavement includes breaking the law, military defeat, abandonment of children, voluntary slavery to pay off debt, earning money due to poverty, children born into slavery, exploitation of cheaper labor, and other forms of slavery instituted along demographic lines such as race or sex, like the Arab slave trade of European and African people. Slaves were kept in bondage for life, or for a fixed period of time, after which they would be granted freedom. Slavery was a typical feature of human civilization of ancient empires and was legal in most societies. In chattel slavery, the slave is legally rendered the personal property, chattel, of the slave owner. African slavery, notably the transatlantic slave trade, part of the global oceanic slave trade that took 10 to 12 million enslaved African men, women, and children to the Americas from the 15th to the 19th century, introduced a system of slavery that was commercialized, racialized, and inherited. Enslaved people were seen not as people at all, but as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited. The slave trade involved the forced abduction and transport of Africans by Europeans, colonial powers, to the New World as chattel slaves. Slaves lived below the decks, in conditions of squalor and indescribable horror pack, together like books on a shelf. Disease spread and ill health was one of the biggest killers. Suicide was a frequent occurrence, often by refusal of food or medicine or jumping overboard. It is estimated that 2 million Africans died during the journey to the Americas. This brutal system exploited individuals' labor, stripped them of basic rights, and perpetuated racial hierarchies and discrimination. Once in the colonies, slaves could expect to be held for life as the property of their masters, working on sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations, and denied the right to live and move as they please. The history of indentured labor reaches back to ancient times, when people typically became indentured servants after borrowing money and agreeing to pay off the debt over a specified term. Modern indentured servitude emerged as a form of labor in where individuals, including Europeans such as Irish, Scots, and Portuguese, as well as Asians, primarily Indians, Chinese, referred to as coolies, and Indonesians and Africans, were recruited often under false pretenses or kidnapped, entered into indenture contracts, and transported to the New World and the Pacific, binding them to work for a set period on a plantation in a state of interlocking incarceration. Terms of indenture ranged from 1 to 7 years, with typical terms of 4 or 5 years.
Instead of execution, you may be transported to His Majesty's colony.
Others work mainly to construct roads and railway systems. While offering a pathway to potential freedom, indentured servitude still subjected individuals to harsh conditions and limited liberties during their servitude. After their indenture expired, the immigrants were free to work for themselves or another employer. Though indentured servitude did exist before landowners turned to African slaves as a more profitable and ever-renewable source of labor, the shift to indentured servants surged again after the global slave trade was outlawed and slavery was abolished in most of the world. Indentureship not only preceded, coexisted with, and survived slavery in the Americas, but was distinct in law and in practice from slavery. Throughout history, various groups of people experienced serfdom, slavery, and indentured servitude. Serfs in Western Europe and much longer in Eastern Europe endured feudal obligations and limited freedoms. African slaves had no rights and no freedoms, while indentured servants from diverse backgrounds, including Europeans, Africans, and Asians, labored in colonial ventures across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, had limited rights under a contracted arrangement. Of all the forced labor systems mentioned above, enslaved Africans was the greatest crime against humanity in terms of its scale and its social, psychological, spiritual, and physical brutality, specifically inflicted upon a targeted ethnicity. This vastly profitable business, and the subsequent suppression of the inhumanity and criminal nature of slavery, was devoid of all moral and legal values. Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, the largest legal form of unfree labor with the Caribbean at its center. Approximately 40% of Africans who were sold into slavery were transported to the Caribbean islands, which overtook Portuguese Brazil as the main market for forced labor in the 17th century. The region's sugar plantations, which were mostly owned and run by English, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Danish colonists. Crucially, the slave code, an instrument that was first implemented by the English in Barbados, was the product of chattel slavery's most severe legal form in the Caribbean. This extensive ordinance, which was passed in 1661, classified Africans as heathens and brutes, unfit to be subject to the same laws as Christians. Africans were then defined by the legislators as non-human beings, a type of property that would always belong to the buyers and their successors. the slave code spread like wildfire throughout the Caribbean and eventually served as the template for slavery in the English colonies in North America that would eventually become the United States. While serfdom gradually declined with social and economic changes, African slavery persisted until abolition movements and legal reforms challenged its foundations. Indentured servitude also waned with changing economic structures and labor demands, marking shifts in global labor practices and human rights considerations. The Islamic Republic of Mauritania was the last country in the world to officially ban slavery in 1981. Modern forms of enslavement today, despite slavery being illegal, includes forced labor in factories, sweatshops, and private homes, human and child trafficking, debt bondage, forced marriages, child soldiers, and sexual slavery. Modern slavery, where victims are either forced to work against their will or are prevented from leaving the situation, nets traffickers more than $150 billion each year. Thankfully, slavery is no longer legally protected anywhere in the world. Yet the control and exploitation of one human being by another still remains. Let's us take this into grave consideration as fellow human beings. What are your thoughts on serfdom, slavery, and indentured servitude? Should we forgive and forget and learn from the past, or allow folks to continue to divide us along the ideology of Darwinian, and do you think enough is being done to curtail the modern forms of enslavement? Remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more on A Cup of History.